think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Hauk. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, know that we will be setting aside some time at the end of today's discussion for audience questions. If you have a question for any of the speakers, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen of your Zoom window and type your question into the box that appears at any time. Please include your name and organization with your question so that we can identify you for the speakers. Now, I'd like to introduce Stoneleigh Foundation board member, Stacey Holland. Stacey?
Thanks, Mark. So good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome everyone to our virtual convening, and on behalf of the staff and the board of directors at the Stoneleigh Foundation, we are excited to host this critical conversation entitled Crisis at the Intersection, Health, Housing, and Racial Justice for Young People. So our objective here today is to have a really candid conversation about the acute crisis among young people who are experiencing homelessness and a lack of access to basic needs. And that includes everything from food to employment to stable housing to education to just a network of caring adults to ensure that they're okay on a daily basis. But we would be remiss if we did not layer this conversation around what's happening with this global health crisis with COVID-19, a stalled economy that quite frankly was challenging for our young people in the first place before crisis, and also this racial and civil unrest that's happening that I would dare say is an awakening. And that as our country begins to awaken, how do we think about adjusting and weaving in these conversations and are changing our policies, our procedures, our practices, and our behaviors, both individually and as organizations. So our hope today is we'll have a conversation around how do we begin naming these real issues that are facing our young people? What policies at the federal, state, and local level help and or hinder the development of a progressive agenda around youth homelessness? And what can we as individual professionals and citizens do about this crisis? In other words, how can we change the game for our kids? And how do we stop talking about it, but changing our practice so we can actually pave a better future for them? So today our goal is to hear from three experts who represent a practitioner lens, a local policy and practice lens, and federal policy. We hope that you hear some information that will motivate you to action and allow you to question some of the work that you're doing personally and professionally. Change can only come if individuals begin to reflect on our position of power and figure out how we can make a change in your immediate sphere of influence. So we hope you hear something today that empowers you. So let me introduce our panel. And I first want to start off with Roshni Stanford. She's a 2017-2019 Emerging Fellow here at the Stoneleigh Foundation. She currently works as a youth housing organizer at the People's Emergency Center. Second, we'll hear from Cameron McConkey. Is also an Emerging Fellow, currently 2019 to 2021. He's actually working right now at Philadelphia's FIGHT, Youth Health Empowerment Project Center here in Philadelphia, and will represent our local lens. And then we have Darla Barndine, who's the Executive Director of the National Network for Youth, and she will lend her voice to the conversation to talk about the federal policy landscape. So our format this morning is that every panelist will have 5 minutes to share an opening statement. Then I will ask a few questions that we as a panel have prepared. And then we're going to open up to the audience for questions. We're asking that you post your questions in the chat box throughout the session, and then we'll go to a facilitated process once the panelists have given their statements. So let me turn it over to Roshni, who will provide us with her opening statements.
Hi, everybody. My name is Roshni Stanford. I'm a social worker and community organizer. I formerly worked with the Stoneleigh Foundation to co-found a youth-led housing justice group called Youth Healers Stand Up. But I'm currently a social worker at the Achieving Independence Center, which is a foster care drop-in center run by Valley Youth House. I run a mentoring program there. So what I'm seeing is a result of the youth organizers that I work with and have contact with, but also the young people at the AIC that I do counseling with or set up mentorships for. So how it's affecting youth on the ground, we're seeing first and foremost an increase in mental health crises. And we're seeing a lot of youth relying on the AIC and other grassroots groups to provide virtual emotional support. Seeing an increase in vulnerability to violence, abuse, and mistreatment, as well as criminal justice involvement. Early on in the lockdown, we saw resource parents and foster parents locking out their youth and not believing them about what the new regulations were. We're seeing disrupted placements, avoidance of shelters. The definition of homelessness has definitely affected youth's access to shelter as well. Definitely employment issues. Youth are like the first to get laid off. Youth programs for employment have gotten interrupted. And a lot of their jobs were the most exposed to COVID, including retail. Definitely increase in difficulty accessing basic needs and resources. And during COVID, grassroots groups definitely stepped up to provide those basic needs and funds, groceries, medication pickups, and transportation in cash. And these groups don't always get a lot of recognition by large nonprofits and kind of the powers that be that run funding. But those groups raise a lot of money from the community to get resources to young people who are dealing with homelessness, elders, and organizers who are also kind of leading the fight for healthcare equity, for housing equity. Grassroots groups picked up a lot of steam around housing and tenants' rights during COVID because of the increase in homelessness and housing insecurity, and because the homelessness crisis in Philly became very apparent to everyone during COVID when, everyone's supposed to go home and shelter, but not everybody has access to that. Because of that, young people have definitely disappeared. Young people in my network, young people from the healers have definitely fallen off the map. So, right now, as we're going kind of back in a yellow phase, even though we're only going back to the office once a week, we're going to definitely try to reconnect with youth who've fallen off from the AIC as well. And then the recent uprisings, racial justice movement, iterations that have been happening recently and have been intensifying, they've intensified all of these issues, including access to pharmacies. Grocery stores in West Philly remain closed after the uprisings that occurred there. Young people are definitely affected by having seen tanks and militarized vehicles rolling through their neighborhoods and posted up in their neighborhoods, and tear gas filling up their parents' homes or their grandparents' homes. A lot of youth are reporting increased negative interactions with the police, including neighbors, and increased racial tension where they live, and just increased fear in general. And I know that there have been some major losses in the trans community locally and nationally, and LGBTQ. Sorry about that. And LGBTQ. Definitely dealing with the trauma, and Black women and femmes as well are dealing with the trauma of community violence as well, and how that interacts with police violence and policing, and the lack of safety there. So during COVID and before these uprisings, those were already things that were on our minds. And so at this point, all of those things are definitely majorly intensified. And at the same time, grassroots groups have also intensified their funding streams and wealth distribution models that they're coming up with, and raising money to solve homelessness on their own by raising money for things like tiny houses for Black trans folks. The community, that is people who are LGBTQ, people who are young themselves, people who might be housing insecure themselves, have raised over $100,000 for Morris Home, which is one of the few transitional housing units for trans people in the city, after they recently lost one of their members to community violence. They're one of the few places that have beds designated for trans young people, and they're able to raise that much money. So I think one of the things I want to get across is how young people are becoming very connected to the work on the grassroots, work with the grassroots, and are receiving a lot of resources from there. And so I think that it would be best if nonprofits listen to the grassroots. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rodney. That was a really compelling kind of large list of the things that are facing young people. So let me now turn to Cameron and ask him to share his 5 minutes.
Sure. Yeah, so thank you, Stacy. Thank you to the staff and board at Stoneleigh and to the folks here on the call for joining us this morning. And I know what will be, a critical conversation about this moment in our young people's lives and for our city. My name again is Cameron McConkey. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a current Stoneleigh Emerging Leader Fellow at the YHEP Health Center. So for those of you who don't know, the YHEP Health Center is the only adolescent and young adult specific community health center here in Philadelphia. And it's part of a larger umbrella organization of community health centers known as Philadelphia Fight. Annually, we serve about 1,000 young people for medical and behavioral health care, including primary care, sexual and reproductive health care, mental health care, and gender affirming care, to name a few. We have a rich history in the city of serving young people, including and particularly young people experiencing homelessness, as well as LGBTQ young people and Black and Brown youth. And my work at YHEP, as you can probably imagine, is evolving as we speak, but is broadly about expanding access to healthcare and promoting youth well-being primarily through youth inclusion and community partnership. But I'm here today as part of this conversation really to listen and to learn as much as everyone else and to share, some of my perspectives from the youth advocacy work I'm involved in. I know we can all appreciate that what is going on in this country, be it a viral pandemic or one of violence and police brutality against Black and Brown people, we are at a very critical intersectional crisis that's weighing heavily on young people and on our city systems. To kind of give you some perspective, when we started planning for this call just a month ago, our topic was narrowly, although not simply in any means, about youth homelessness. George Floyd was still alive. The statue of Mayor Rizzo still stood across from City Hall, and the hashtag defund the police didn't even exist yet. It feels really as though social change is happening on a new timeline, and I want to sort of provide a little additional perspective on that. It's been just over 3 months since Congress passed the first coronavirus relief package. It's been just over 2 months since Philadelphia saw its first COVID-related death. And it's been just over 1 month since Mayor Kinney released his revised operating budget for the next fiscal year, a budget that City Council is just days away from fully resolving. So much has changed in such a short period of time that I think it's hard to identify just one issue or one crisis or one solution to focus on. But it also made me think maybe there's a lesson to be learned there about how these systems and the way young people interact with them can be improved. We hear a lot of people say that this crisis or this moment in history has laid bare the inequities that have existed in our society and in our city forever. However, for me and for a lot of the young people that we work with, those inequities were not hidden. They were not buried under the surface, and they were not awaiting some global catastrophe to show their face. They were burning on the surface, and I think in the last 3 months, we've really been fanning and fueling that fire. I think as Rashni mentioned, this is a critical moment for grassroots organizing, for mutual and community aid, for community development, mental health support, and our young people, they need help. They need security, job security, housing security. They need a steady income and a voice in this conversation. But I think grassroots movements and youth organizing cannot do it alone. Our funders, our system stakeholders, and our elected officials have to hold space to listen to them and to change the way we move forward. I think one of my favorite mantras from this moment goes something like this: normal wasn't working. Back to normal is not the answer. And I really do believe that. In my last minute, and in the spirit of being the middle child between on-the-ground organizing and federal policy change, I want to also highlight that this is an incredibly important week for our city. We are anticipating City Council's vote on the operating budget, which includes huge cuts to programs like the Free Library, Arts and Culture, and Development and Planning. We're also awaiting a vote on the Emergency Housing Protection Act, which is a set of 5 bills aimed at preventing a domino effect of evictions in the city. And we're also awaiting a full picture on how Philadelphia envisions the future for policing and community safety. I think while there is a crisis at the intersection, no doubt, there is also hope. We know that housing is health, that social connection and family support are health, that comprehensive education and youth skill development are health. For those reasons, I do feel incredibly mobilized on all of these issues. And I just wanted to share, we work with young people holistically, recognizing that often what is making them unwell is not their behavior or their diet, it's the world that they have to wade through. And so my hope, and what I hope to sort of have a conversation about this morning, is that our city and the systems that are involved with it need to start to appreciate that reality and be a part of the conversation to shape it and make it better. So thanks.
Thank you, Cameron. Darla? We can hear you.
Yes. Sorry. Is this good?
Yes, perfect.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Stoneleigh Foundation, for inviting me to participate in this important virtual conversation. And thank you all who showed up to participate. I promise we'll get to Q&A soon. My pronouns are she, her, hers. The National Network for Youth, we partner with over 30 young people from across the country who have experienced homelessness as a young person in America. We also partner with over 300 community-based youth homelessness service providers across the country. Our work is really a partnership with young people and with service providers. It's focused on affecting systemic change through policy advocacy reform. It's focused on accelerating innovative practice in communities and creating national and local communities of learning. Youth of color and LGBTQ youth disproportionately experience homelessness in America. Structural racism is a direct cause of the circumstances that lead Black and brown youth to experience homelessness, and it negatively impacts their ability to not only exit homelessness, but access the education and employment necessary to achieve upward economic mobility. For example, youth who encounter the foster care or juvenile justice systems are much more likely to experience homelessness than young people who do not encounter those experiences. We also know Black and brown youth are much more likely to encounter those systems than white youth. And when you examine both of those systems, you find institutional racism that disproportionately increases the number of Black and brown children, youth, and families that become ensnared in these systems when compared to white youth. We also know that young people who are experiencing homelessness are much more likely to encounter law enforcement, experience police brutality, and to become ensnared in the criminal or juvenile justice system just because they're experiencing homelessness. The coronavirus pandemic has only exacerbated these disparities that clearly already existed, as Cameron and Roshni outlined, and has made it much more difficult, I think, for us as local community and as a nation to ignore the impact of racism. Job loss already disproportionately impacted Black and brown youth. That has increased. Many young people who were experiencing couch surfing or doubled up homelessness are now experiencing street homelessness, as Roshni pointed out. And there are huge disparities in the definitions of homelessness, depending on whether it's the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's definition of homelessness or the U.S. Department of Education's definition of homelessness, which is broader. Many young people experiencing homelessness have been unable to access the economic stimulus payments. The main reason is because their parents claimed them on their tax returns during the prior 2 years. And so the non-filer IRS form doesn't work for young people who were claimed as dependents during those previous 2 years. Service providers on the ground have really struggled to rapidly retool the services that they provide to young people. They haven't gotten the information that they've needed to quickly enough. Most providers weren't part of their local public health centers' pandemic or crisis planning. They weren't really considered frontline responders in a health crisis when they absolutely are. As a result, our service providers and young people were not receiving personal protective equipment without, weeks and weeks of advocacy. They weren't provided with the latest information or local protocols that they should be following when serving young people. Our providers have also struggled with federal funding streams and state funding streams that are already too rigid, with few $2 to appropriately serve young people, even prior pandemic. The pandemic has only exacerbated those disparities in funding. Federal and state and local policies, procedures, and staffing requirements have made it very difficult for providers to continue to serve youth, keep their programs staffed, and to care for their frontline workers. Providers really struggled with maintaining frontline staff who are predominantly black and brown and working in higher risk positions than management, who were able to work from home during the pandemic and predominantly white. Our providers clearly have needed an influx in funding, not just to keep current operations running, but to expand services in order to meet the need. In our country, no person should be homeless. Our federal, state, and local governments, they have enough money to build affordable housing and to provide comprehensive services to children, youth, families, and individuals experiencing homelessness. We simply need the political will at the federal, state, and local level to spend less on systems that harm Black and brown people and instead provide the housing and services and opportunities that they deserve. Even in light of a pandemic, Congress and the administration have failed to provide the level of funding that young people need and have come nowhere near to providing the flexibility that service providers need. At the National Network for Youth, we've been working and advocating for flexible funding through the CARES Act, which Cameron mentioned. Many of the programs did not get the increased flexibility from Congress that they needed. Just last week, we did have a bipartisan bill introduced in the Senate in an attempt to really get flexible funding using a broader definition of homelessness, so using the U.S. Department of Education definition of homelessness instead of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's definition. The funding stream would be administered at HHS instead of HUD, so it would be administered by the Administration on Children and Families. If the bill were to become law, which we hope that it is included in the next coronavirus relief package, it would be flexible funding directly to communities targeted to children, youth, and families experiencing homelessness. And the money could be spent on a number of things that have been identified by young people. In conclusion, I encourage all of you to get involved locally where you live and nationally, both in advocacy and in supporting organizations with your pocketbook, and really invest in organizations who are seeking to fight structural racism and are centering young people in how they're advocating and in how they're providing services to young people. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Darlene. Really thank you to both Rashni and Cameron as well for your thoughtful comments. So I'm going to take a challenge that I feel like I heard from Cameron about. We are not going to go back. We're going to figure out a way forward. That being the case, I'd like to challenge the panel and the audience to do two things as we move into question and answers. One, think like a kid. If you are a young person, as an adult, we don't remember. If you're a young person and you're telling them, oh, your basic needs aren't met. Well, for a kid, that means I can't eat today. Or go get this voucher. Well, for a kid, I'm thinking I got to get to the place where they have the voucher. So how do I do that? And if we start thinking like young people that are in this situation and we start building solutions for them and systems for them and policies for them that actually meet that need, and we bring it down off the, oh, they're housing insecure. No, they have no place to go at 5 o'clock. And I remember vividly running a youth center up in North Philly and having to go get a young person a hotel room because he got thrown out of his house and couldn't go back. And this 6'4" young man-child, leaving him on the steps of a Holiday Inn, literally petrified. What do I do here? And so we've got to think about those solutions for that young person in that moment. Because the solution was, yes, get him a hotel room, but the real solution was he needed somebody to stay with him and navigate and explain and then figure out what was going to happen the next day and the next day and the next day. We just solved a moment. So I want to challenge us to think about how do we develop human-centered responses with our young people at the center? And the second is, what can people do in thought, word, and deed to support these proactive solutions? So for the panel, as you each talked about, there are proactive things that we can do as a collective community. What can people do about the way they think about this issue, about how they can talk about this issue to others so they can motivate to action, and then what can they physically do? And anyone can jump in.
I think I can go. Sorry.
I was gonna say Monday.
My bad. Was someone going?
No,
No.
go.
Yeah.
I think that challenging for folks whose work is typically in nonprofit institutions or foundations or institutional systems, challenging yourself to find other sources of information besides the same news articles or the same journal articles, and challenging yourself to kind of what Stacey was just saying, like think about what youth are thinking about. If we come out of this period and young people got their bills paid, got fed, got housed through groups that are not 501c3s, through community sourced money that was democratic, non-hierarchical, is not connected to any surveillance systems, any police systems, any child welfare systems, and it's safe too. Young people who are LGBTQ, who are trans and on the street already don't trust institutions and systems and already avoid them. The reason why the AIC has such high interaction rate or engagement rate is because of the relationships and because of the flexibility of the staff and Valley Youth House and being able to respond to things like the recent uprisings quickly. So if you've come out of this having gotten way more resources and support from grassroots groups and collectives rather than nonprofits, then it's going to eventually change the model of how services are done, how institutions are run, how nonprofits even exist. And so I just challenge folks to find other sources of information to understand what youth are consuming and understanding as the world around them and as the systems and resources that are around them. For instance, there's a mutual aid group that was started called John Aid to address the fact that youth were not getting their stimulus checks. They're not able to access PGW's special program if they even have one for COVID, because it's not in their name, it's in their grandma's name, and their grandma doesn't talk to them about that stuff. John Aid, I was able to get a youth's utility bills paid. I was able to get food delivered to another youth. And, that's just like that was just a Black trans person who was like, I'll just raise the money myself. Like, we don't have time to put money into a foundation, wait to hear about further grant to come back. Like, our sisters and brothers are dying in the street right now. And right now, a lot of young people are putting their cash apps online, and they're using that as a form of reparations and wealth redistribution. And they're advocating for the most direct form of compensation or cash or resources as possible. If that's money, if that's medication, transportation, or cash. And so I wonder if there is some sort of paradigm shift or change within foundations or the way that money flows into communities so that it can reflect how people are actually accessing resources. Same thing with building housing, creating new beds. Like, we've been trying to advocate for new beds for trans youth, for unaccompanied youth forever. Our only shelter in Philadelphia or one of our few shelters for youth under 18 is supposed to have a certain amount of beds for unaccompanied homeless youth, and they're usually filled up by child welfare youth instead. So, if the grassroots are able to create housing, advocate for tiny houses, get them built quicker than foundations, then there might be, a disconnect there, or there might be something to learn there.
So there were some really good examples in that. The first, which I just want to summarize, this idea of folks in systems and philanthropies have to figure out how to get more flexible funding to grassroots organizations. We also have to elevate who those organizations are in the future so we know how to connect. It's an issue of safety for the young person and who can actually get to the young person quicker and more flexible than it be about, in traditional times, people think about, oh, well, if they're not a 501c3, they haven't been vetted. But the problem is we haven't solved the problem through 501c3s. So we need to figure out another way to get to those grassroots organizations. And more importantly, if I'm thinking like a kid, I will trust this person who I know in community versus going to a shelter. And the second thing is this idea about housing and building new opportunities for young people who are homeless. And I'm curious from the panel, what are you hearing about opportunities? What are you hearing about building new beds and creating new housing available? This housing problem has been a problem since I've been working, which is a long time, and we've not solved it. So what do you think are some proactive solutions we can come up with in terms of providing more housing for kids?
So from a national perspective, right at the beginning of the coronavirus, there was a lot of emergency or temporary programs or housing going up in different communities across the country. So churches were opening their space and they were putting beds, cots 6 feet apart. And so it was very much, I think, a crisis emergency response, which is not what we're talking about. We're really talking about longer term affordable housing options for young people. I think the big challenge that we face is that often in communities there, especially smaller communities, maybe there's one youth specific program. In urban centers, there could be anywhere from 2 to 5 different programs, but there aren't really a lot of different options for young people to kind of move along a continuum and ultimately exit into their own housing as a independent adult. What I think communities that have really been coming together, trying to implement a human-centered design approach, a youth-centric design, have really focused on housing options. So there's a need for affordable housing. There's a need for more beds and flexible beds. A lot of the funding streams, which we've heard from, Roshni and Cameron, a lot of the funding streams are, you have to be juvenile justice involved for this bed, or you have to be child welfare involved for this bed, or you have to be under the age of 18, or you have to be 18 or older, but under the age of 22. There's so many requirements for the different funding streams, or this definition of homelessness, but not that. It completely misses the fluidity of homelessness for young people. So maybe they'll meet the definition one week, but they won't the next. So I think what we kind of need to do is just break down all these barriers in policy at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. And we really need to have flexible funding that's going into addressing the root causes of the lack of affordable housing. There's NIMBYism. I mean, I know providers in Chicago who had money to build new programs, to build new housing, but there was no community where it would pass through the process to get it zoned to build that housing, because individuals, homeowners, were organizing against that. And so there's these local issues of homeowners not wanting affordable housing to be built, and it being very expensive, and just the government not putting the money into it and not doing the work that needs to be done to get the zoning and the housing built. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Cameron, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I think with regard to specifically like housing opportunities, Roshni and Darla definitely covered everything. I don't have much to add on top of that.
So going to this idea of flexible funding, and we have many individuals who've joined us from philanthropy, and I'm curious as to your thoughts about what role philanthropy can play to support this crisis, and what are some tangible actions that they could do to help this issue?
I just want to reiterate the point that within the culture, there's a generation of people, of Black people and brown people, Indigenous people, who are very interested in the economics of racial justice. To them, it is, to young people, it's about where can we, it's basically about like reparations. And I think before now, it was something that folks in other generations kind of laughed at, or like we've tried that a lot, or, you know, it's sort of an outdated, you know, Pan-African type of thing, or I don't know. But I think right now it feels like a reality, and it feels like something that younger white folks are doing and are convincing their family members who have wealth to do. And it's something that, you know, it's literally how we're getting like food in some of my friends' mouths, and rent paid, and repairs in houses. And I don't think there are any funds in Philadelphia that can be as flexible as that, like get someone's roof fixed. Even like the Center for Returning Citizens got looted, you know, during some of the uprisings and rioting. And the community was able to pull together, you know, $10,000 to replace all the equipment within a week. And I don't know that any other foundation would have been able to pull that money together the way that the community does. So I think like if young people or the younger generations are doing so much personal work to try to figure out, like me as a Black woman who has, you know, education, I'm LGBTQ, I have disabilities, but I also have educational and financial privilege. What can I do to help build a new world after this financially? If people who are kind of like, you know, just workers are able to do that, then I think people who are sitting on a lot of wealth need to kind of reassess and think about, like, how can we get with the culture? How can we relate to youth right now who want some tangible differences in how power and wealth is distributed? And people are making plans for, you know, I know I have friends who are raising money for a future fund, which is, you know, people can pay monthly into a fund to build for a free school, so people can take classes on skills ongoing, and, you know, have childcare for free. You know, we don't know what's going to happen with school in the future. We don't know what's going to happen with policing in the future. And communities who don't have wealth are doing a lot of proactive planning to create solutions for themselves in the future. And I think are turning away in some ways from foundations because they haven't been able to provide those resources and flexible funds in the past. So just as far as like on the ground, like culture, like the paradigm shift culturally, there, I know I have friends who are organizing septuagenarians to, you know, give a portion of their retirement, you know, to a young person's, you know, mortgage or educational fund, or to pay down debt, because those are the things that are creating inequity. You know, to be able to get a master's degree but be in so much more debt than my white counterparts, that's an inequity. You know what I mean? To be able to get a house or not get a house and be a renter for my life versus buying a house, that's a difference in experience. And so my generation, and definitely Generation Z under me, they have a very different sense of what does justice look like, and it doesn't really look like a program necessarily, or you know, more social workers surveilling their behavior. And so I think while a lot of communities are thinking about what's coming after this, I think that philanthropy needs to also think about how can we trust our community members more? How can we think about, you know, doing away with some of the stringent guidelines and things like that, because that's not where the world is like moving.
Well, I think one of the things that came out of that, and Cameron, I'll get to you next, and then we have a question. So one of the things that came out of that for me is that communities, specifically this community of young people, are self-organizing, and they're figuring out in that self-organizing space how we access people that have discretionary income, and then create vehicles, Cash App, whatever the case may be, to get that money immediately to the young people and their needs in the moment, right? And that in and of itself is a huge shift, right? I'm not old enough to have attended one, but I remember my parents talking about the rent parties and the things that they would go to in order to support themselves and their neighbors at times. And so this shift, as we think about, we've been trying to solve this from a systems perspective. And yes, you need more liberal policies, you need more flexible policies, but I would say you need policies that actually reflect the need on the ground, right? So if we shift to a a kid-centric policy perspective. You need that. But you also need real practical ways that are not necessarily formal programming to meet the needs of these young people, because they're consumers and they're saying, I don't trust that system. And so I can't come into the system because the system itself is too rigid. And until these public dollars release the rigidity, and I would say philanthropic dollars release the rigidity, we're not going to solve the problem, because the problem is the kids can't access quickly or trust the system that's trying to reach out.
I will
Cameron.
also add that, like, Cameron, you know that like the Healers created a whole 5-point plan for how they thought youth homelessness could be ended in the city, and that was based off of hundreds of youth input that they led through workshops and got their input about. And there are a bunch of different things, but one of the main things is they just want to rehab all the abandoned houses and create youth housing for it. And their ideas back when we were talking for youth-led housing was, you know, different models of housing instead of the typical PHA voucher, you know, model. Why not have tenant-run co-ops, which used to be very common and are really long-lasting and last a lot longer than a lot of residential housing programs, because they are tenant-run and they're kind of self-governed, and are kept up really well. We have a few of those in Philly, but there haven't been any new ones. And that was one of the things on their plan that they wanted, was just building new housing, building a drop-in center. And so I think projects like those, like there are a lot of community plans that have already happened. North Philly Peace Park is planning a long-term sustainability plan for North Philly. We need accountants. We need people to help with legal issues. We need to help with zoning, planning. Like grassroots groups need that expertise, even if it's not money. Like if that's not where the comfort level is, they need expertise around legal things, zoning, accountants. I know I have an organizing group around mental health that could use an accountant right now, that could use marketing. So even in those ways, those things it takes so much labor to get movements off the ground, emotionally and physically and economically. Like those things could really help out Black-led groups or youth-led groups in getting their solutions, which are very direct. Like, you know, if we had enough money in a pool, we could buy up a bunch of abandoned houses and rehab them and rent them out to people. And that wouldn't have to go through any government, anything. Like it would just be landlords, and we could turn it into an LLC, make it tenant owned, have youth, you know, graduate through those housing things, take care of it, repair it, maintain it, and learn how to have a home. And you would have a sustained stream of housing. But that requires a team of people. And organizers are not all lawyers, they're not all philanthropists. We're like trying to do it on our own with the skills that we have. So
that is an excellent point, Rashni. Thank you for that. Cameron.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly say more to Rashni, like your original point, you know, kind of when you were speaking directly to funders and philanthropy, you know, this idea of like directly funding, you know, youth and Black and brown people in the community and grassroots movements, I imagine can seem sort of scary for funders and for philanthropy and for grant makers. And I guess what I was hearing when I was listening to Rashni talk is that if all of that seems scary or impossible, or, you know, to have money flowing without it linked to outcomes and evaluation programs and all of this stuff, just know that you've already done it. So I work at Philadelphia Fight, like I said, and we are a recipient of Philadelphia's COVID-19 Nonprofit Relief Fund, which is a very unrestricted fund that is, you know, predominantly funded by, you know, private philanthropy dollars. And that money came to us. I mean, I wrote that proposal alongside some of our staff, and it was the easiest, shortest proposal I've written. I didn't need to talk about outcomes. I didn't need to talk about evaluations. It was about getting money to community organizations that needed it now. And so I think my comment to the funders on the call, or whoever's on the call listening to this, is that it is possible, and that it's no different than what you did a few months ago when you sort of held together the nonprofit community in this city. This is just another model in which, you know, that money can be more directly delivered to the community. And so just to know that it's possible and that your money didn't go to waste. We are greatly appreciative, and we did a lot of good work as folks like Morris Home that Rashni mentioned that have raised $100,000 in just a few days from GoFundMe and started a new community garden over the weekend. Like, it can happen, and it can happen fast.
Thank you for that reminder. We have one question from the audience from the Juvenile Law Center. So their question is, are you hearing of any of the funds from the COVID Relief Fund from the CARES Act being allocated locally to young people for navigators, warm lines, case management, housing? Is there any advocacy being done to make sure that a large portion of this money benefits young people?
I can't speak to if any of it went locally in Philadelphia. I can speak to the fact that a lot of the CARES Act dollars is not going directly to young people or to service providers at the community level. A lot of the HUD money is going to adult homelessness service providers, not that we want to take their money, but there really isn't a dedicated, good definition, federal flexible funding stream for children, youth, and families experiencing homelessness. That's what we're working on with the Emergency Family Stabilization Act that was introduced in the Senate last week. Hopefully it'll be introduced in the House with a lot more money. We are working on that advocacy. The CARES Act did not allow a lot of flexibility in how the funding was used. We've heard that across programs. So across federal agencies and programs, the CARES Act was not the be all end all in terms of providing flexible federal dollars directly to individuals or to communities. That's why there's a lot more work to be done. And I think even underlines the importance of philanthropy even more. I mean, we have service providers who are trying to show that flexible funding actually accomplishes better outcomes for young people. Whenever service providers don't have to worry about all the different eligibility requirements and check boxes from this funding stream and this funding stream and this funding stream and that funding stream, and they can just focus their efforts on being youth-centric, on listening to young people as opposed to filling out paperwork and trying to make the money fit in their budgets. And they're actually able to focus on centering young people and retooling and becoming more innovative and changing how they operate. When they're able to do that, they're achieving better outcomes. So I think, like what Roshni and Cameron were saying, we need federal policies to change to be more flexible, but that takes long-term support from philanthropy for those of us who do the work on the Hill to actually achieve those, systemic reforms at the policy level. But now philanthropy can invest locally and flexibly. Don't require budgets. Just give money directly to people, to communities, to organizations. The more time we have to fit our numbers into the budget and do reporting or fill out long grant applications, that's less time that, I'm on the Hill or our service providers or community organizers are actually helping young people. So I think if philanthropy can kind of flip their approach, instead of trying to fit organizations and individuals into their 10-year foundation strategic plans, but instead be flexible and responsive to the needs of today, not their 10-year plan for philanthropic giving, then I know you're gonna see, better outcomes for young people, and you're gonna see more youth-centric and transformed, I think, systems and programs on the ground.
So thank you. I want to acknowledge the fact that we have 48 participants on the call. So if someone actually has a question, please feel free to put it in the chat box and I'll read it. But I also want to pivot our conversation a bit. That was a really rich conversation about what's happening on the ground with young people, some creative ideas. And I want to reframe, it's not necessarily creative ideas. It's, again, if we think like a kid and we think about a kid who's homeless, ways to get them money, ways to get them stability, ways to get them connected to community. We've got to think about flexibility first, and we've got to think about rapid response, which is quick. You got to be able to respond in the moment. You can't wait for another 10, 20, 30 days until you can put a grant proposal together, things of that sort. For the policymakers, I think what we heard was you have to think flexibly. You got to think long-term. You got to think about these potential other vehicles that are emerging on the ground. And then last, we've got to figure out how to get this groundswell movement that's happening without formalizing it, but getting it into the mainstream so people understand what it is and they can connect to it. So if there's someone on the call that says, I would love to support a young person and or organization, how do I do that quickly? And who is that organization and how do I connect to them? So thank you for that. I want to pivot. We have exactly 20 minutes left. And I want to talk some just about this racial justice cry that has happened. The cauldron has boiled over, right? Racial injustice has been here since the founding of this country. We now have the perfect storm of a global health crisis, an economy that is tanked, and at the same time, we have a very blatant issue around policing. How are these things impacting homeless youth? And what should we be thinking about in reference to creating a new normal where everyone is treated equitably, and specifically this population?
I think there's a lot of overlap between people on the ground who are doing organizing or who are showing up like at demonstrations and marches and the youth that we serve. They, people under the age of 24 have really they haven't created this movement. I feel like they're really carrying it forward into like the next phase of this country, and are also kind of learned from the previous generation and are able to like put together better asks and things like that. Right now, the Black and Brown Workers Collective has organized, has helped support a self-organized group of housing insecure people on the Parkway who have set up an autonomous zone. And they have a number of asks, including building tiny houses and allocating money from the land trust, saving that money for the community and for community-run and community-led work. And so I feel like because of quarantine, it's been hard to get down to the encampment or to places like that because of the lockdown, to actually get on the ground voices from youth about like, young people who are within that community and what they're seeing their future is within that zone. Yeah, so I just feel like, again, like listening to young people and the plans and people who are housing insecure as a movement, because I think they're able to connect that housing justice back to racial justice in Philadelphia in particular. And so, yeah, again, those groups also need those projects funded as well.
I think for me, this is a different answer than Rashni's. I'm sorry. I guess this racial issue that has boiled over, like you said, in the last few months, has existed forever, as I sort of alluded to in the comment, that these inequities and that these isms, they've always been there. And to sort of say that it took COVID to like unearth them, I think is offensive, honestly, to like people who have been experiencing them all of their life. I think for me, as a white person, I've been reflecting a lot on this, and I've thought of a saying, and I realized I actually didn't know until after the fact that the saying does not mean anything like what I was interpreting it to mean. But the saying, and I'm sure many of you have heard it, is "I think, therefore I am," and it's really about a philosophical belief of existence. But for me, it speaks to something that I think is really pervasive, and it's about sort of this concept of implicit bias. And I don't mean to bring up this term. I think it's so overused, and implicit bias isn't just a training that your nonprofit or your system offers through HR or its diversity board. I really do believe that it is like the driving force behind racism and transphobia, ableism, and adultism. And I think as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, even when all of the racist statues come down, and even when all of these Supreme Court decisions are read, implicit bias is still going to exist. I was reading stories after the Supreme Court decision came out about LGBTQ workplace equality, particularly for trans folks who live in states and jurisdictions that were granted protections through that decision. And for them, the reality of the on the ground moment is that, yeah, it's great that I'm not going to get fired because I'm trans, but has my work environment with my transphobic boss really changed all that much? And so I think, as all white people, myself included, we have a very long time coming and a very uncomfortable road ahead with ourselves. And I think, what I've been reflecting on with this statement, I think, therefore I am, the statement doesn't go, I am, therefore I think, and showing up to protests and posting on social media, is not enough alone to dismantle that, implicit racist way of thinking that is, plagues our nonprofits and our systems in Philadelphia and across the country. And so when we talk about like making space for and raising marginalized voices, I think one way that we can like actively practice that as white people, I'm speaking to you, white people, is to spend more time sort of critically looking at our own ways of thinking. And I know Roshni sort of mentioned this before, but have you looked at the content you're consuming, and have you intentionally like sought out ways to change that? Have you educated yourself? Have you held really uncomfortable conversations with white peers, and have you developed systems for keeping each other accountable in the workplace and through your families? So for me, and again, like as a white person and thinking about, someone who, I do work in a nonprofit, and I work in a very large, very racist system, the United States healthcare system. And so, when I think about my part as a white person, and I think about, what it means to elevate authentically, youth voices and trans voices and Black and brown voices, I think it starts with like me sort of not talking and spending some time sort of on myself, and then thinking about the ways sort of I grew up and my ancestors, and how that all has informed, my own biases.
Yeah, definitely echo everything Cameron said. As a white person and a white executive director of a national network for youth, I own, my part. I think everybody needs to get educated about white fragility, white dominant culture, the history of structural racism. There are so many resources out there and different groups that you can join. A lot of trainings are now free. The onus is really on me as a white person to get educated, to examine myself, have the uncomfortable conversations with myself and with my white peers. As a white leader of a team of color, it is on me. It's not on anybody that works for me to do the work. And I've seen not only, and within the youth homelessness space more broadly, there are a lot of white CEOs of homeless youth service providers from across the country. We really need to create a space for them to learn, to grow, to retool, and to really think differently. How can they restructure how they operate through the lens of really being grounded in anti-racism? I think there's a huge need within the service provider space. I've been participating, at the national space in these conversations around homelessness, but it's a different conversation, I think, for service providers. And some service providers who have kind of started the anti-racism journey of really figuring out, how can I be an anti-racist community-based service provider for young people? How can I be youth-centric in how I'm providing services? It's uncomfortable. There's a lot of learning. It's not one and done. You don't read one book, go to one webinar, okay, I'm anti-racist. My organization's anti-racist. You can't just update your policies, do a staff seminar, okay, these are our new anti-racist policies. It's not that simple. So, part of what I need to, it's a continual journey personally. I think it's a continual journey for an organization, a national organization and a local organization. There's a lot of support, I think, that providers need to have safe spaces for them to have the conversations, to really figure out how to retool. What I have found from service providers is that peer-to-peer conversations among other service providers is really much more impactful than what I'm saying, because I'm not a service provider, right? I'm an attorney, I'm an advocate. I've never run a direct service provider agency. I hope to never do that. That's not my skill set. But creating safe spaces for service providers to learn, to share, to be authentic, do things differently, to have the flexibility from funders to do things differently, I think that's what will accelerate us, right? For organizations like me to, have our own anti-racism support and consulting, and to really think through how we can change or improve what we're advocating for and federal policies and those conversations. I think there's a moment that needs to not just be this moment, it needs to be sustained. And I think part of my fear is there's a lot of energy, I think, around having these conversations around structural racism and wanting to become anti-racist. My fear is that it's a moment as opposed to a long-term commitment. And so I really encourage funders, as an audience here, to invest in the long term of all of that and at all the different levels that are needed. So systemic change, policy change, community service provider change, and also at an individual level. I don't think we're going to get where we needed to be years ago without all of those.
So I'm going to be a bit provocative, and I'm going to pull philanthropy out of this, funders out of this conversation. Mainly because the funder perch at the end of the day, then what people do is turn themselves into pretzels to meet what the funder wants. So yeah, we can be flexible. My provocative question or statement rather is, what would happen if we actually had the conversation based on the work? Forget the money for a minute, right? Based on the work is individuals. It's me, it's Cameron saying what he said, it's me saying as an African-American woman who obviously have lived this, but also have tons of privilege as well, educationally and economically and other places of just having the safety of a roof over my head, which many of my young people that I served at different points didn't have, right? What would happen if, in the context of this youth housing, that we created vehicles where different types of people could come together and work on how do we build a youth housing process problem, whole community, and we bring that together. And the way we're going to challenge our biases, the way we're going to challenge our language, the way we're going to challenge our thought is by working on something together that actually has a long-term need. And because if we don't create those spaces for experience, I, like you, darling, my fear is this is going to be a moment, right? And so it's going to be a thing, and people are going to talk about the thing, and the thing's going to be over. But if we connect it to the work, the long-term work that has to be done to rebuild, and we do it in community where it is a safe space, where we are learning new language and creating new language, I think that could be a way forward. Yeah.
I feel like there is a group like this called the Philly Homes for Youth Coalition, where it is a bunch of diverse, service providers, policymakers, organizers, and youth who come together and meet regularly to talk about mental health, housing. They help launch the Host Homes program in Philly. There is that, but the funding for that program was cut by the city. The little bit that am I being accurate, Cameron?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it was cut. And so we've been advocating for, to reintroduce that money. That also helps support the YLC, the Young Adult Leadership Committee, which is mostly youth of color who've been through homelessness, who come together to talk about long-term solutions and connect what youth are saying on the ground to policy solutions. They have a bunch of plans and policy solutions all written out. We've been trying to tell them to DBH in the city for years, but our funding got cut recently. And so no, the CARES Act didn't trickle down and give housing providers more money, nor did they give a flexible, problem-solving, diverse, youth-inclusive group the ability to push forward our work, our long-term work that we've been working on for years. And I feel like if there's any role for any funders is to fund things like that, which are about bringing together stakeholders and service providers to work on long-term solutions alongside youth, not in silos.
So Rashmi, can you share the name? Of audience member is asking for the name of the group you just mentioned.
The Philly Homes for Youth Coalition. Cameron, if you want to give a real quick summary.
Yeah, so I'm actually involved in the Philly Homes for Youth Coalition. As Rashni mentioned, this is a group of service providers and youth with lived experience and some system stakeholders, all sort of organized around the issue of youth homelessness. For a year now, this last previous fiscal year, we had funding to have a part-time coordinator, Sean Brown, who has coordinated the sort of activities of this coalition over the last fiscal year. That money came from the Office of Homeless Services in sort of a one-time deal that was not renewed. And so just last week, we were sort of organizing around other creative ways to seek funding to keep that coalition together. So again, it's the Philly Homes for Youth Coalition. We have a website, it's ph4y.org, I think. Let me make sure that's right.
Yes, it is.
And yeah, so yeah.
And I think part of the funding that we were seeking is to pay more youth to be able to do the leadership work. We have youth who are doing so much work. Like, I know that the mental health committee, you guys launched that youth virtual drop-in conversation that the healers and other young people on the mental health committee organized.
And I think, I was just gonna say, and I think to your question or statement, Stacy, and more broadly, I mean, when I think about how can we sort of affect long-term change, I think youth inclusion, authentic youth inclusion, is an amazing solution to that. I think if you want to have, creative and really provocative ideas about how to be anti-racist or anti-transphobic or anti-homophobic, like bring on youth who come from these communities. I mean, this whole conversation has been about thinking like a kid. The best way to think like a kid is to hire them and to involve them in your organization and your work. And then you'll have, an untapped resource of kid creative thoughts. So I think, to the point of the Philly Homes for Youth Coalition and where some of our funding advocacy was going was that, we can't, as service providers and as system stakeholders, we can only do so much. We need the young people with lived experience. The National Network for Youth does this very well, and it's, it's critical, it's necessary to affect.
And I think the meetings are a place where young leaders can come and feel like they are plugging into something that is practical and is kind of pushing towards something real. I was gonna add one more thing that I forgot.
So if we were, thanks everybody. If we were to begin wrapping this up, we have about 6 minutes. And I want to give an opportunity for each of you to kind of give your 1 minute spiel of the important things you want to leave the audience with. And it can be about homelessness, the youth homelessness issue. It can be about this fight for racial justice, this idea about building a new normal. What would you want people to think, to do, to think and to do?
I just want to real quick say that thinking like a kid doesn't mean simplistic or easy or naive. Young people's critical analysis of our world around us, their knowledge of Black history, labor history, queer history, their knowledge of different forms of thought, different types of governance for young people is very, 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 very high. And their ability to pick out different models of thought as far as like queer theory and things like that's very high because they're able to research things on their own and get information on their own. And they're very savvy at doing that. And I think if we want to rebuild or build something new that's more equitable in the future, I think older generations need to kind of do the same. Like they need to, research the new thought that's out here, whether it's like the book Borderlands about like, mestiza culture and, differences in like race and things like that. Or maybe it's, learning about disability justice, which is something that has intersected with racial justice right now, especially in the age of COVID. Maybe it's about neurodiversity, but like understand the new paradigms that are coming through. I remember one time putting something about solidarity on one of the healers posters, and an older staff person saying, "Why are you using the word solidarity? That's so like 70s. It sounds like you're trying to be radical, you're trying to do that." And I'm like, that's the language that young people are using now to understand how different groups come together to fight for resources. That's solidarity. Like, I understand that like that was a different, it might have a different ring to it, But because people haven't been connected with youth culture, they have been thinking like, I don't know, like some, radical people from the 60s have come and radicalized these young people. No, this is the language that's being used now and has been retooled now online for so long and in practice by young people, my generation and people after us. So just get familiar with the new language, get familiar with the new paradigms. If, feminism is your thing, update it, understand the new intersections of queerness, disability, racial justice, there's a lot of updates. A lot of people have been writing new analysis. So get familiar with it.
Darla, thanks, Rashni.
Yeah, I did want to highlight that we, like Cameron and Roshni referred to, we have a local cross-system collaboratives on youth homelessness, a model that we've been developing that is youth-centric. We do have funding from a provider that does pay young people for their time. So I do want to encourage everyone on this call. Are you talking to young people? How are you centering young people in giving out money, in retooling your services, and changing systems, wherever you sit, you can and should be partnering with and centering the expertise and experiences of young people. Where we are, our young people are informing our policy agenda, going to Capitol Hill, meeting with members of Congress, educating Congress, not me, So it really is about young people with a lived experience having access to power to make change. And so I think we can all do a better job at that. And I encourage all of you, as the policy advocate that I am, to take action when you get an advocacy alert from an organization that painstakingly wrote it and has been working on legislation. Contact your members of Congress, make it personal, do phone calls, do meetings. It really does have an impact. Constituents can get their elected officials onto bills and to vote in favor of things much easier than I can as someone who sits in DC. So please be involved in local advocacy, state advocacy, and federal advocacy. It has an impact.
Thanks, Darla. Cameron.
You teed me up so nicely. I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but I wanted to come back, I think, to one of my original comments, which was, I know we spent a lot of time, and rightfully so, sort of on the ground level today, and I really appreciate that. And Roshni, I again learned new things from you. But I sort of wanted to come back to and highlight that this is a really sort of critical moment for our city and for our city's policies right now. And to sort of do what you can to educate yourself. I'm not sure how far I can go into the whole advocacy piece on this call, but do what you can to sort of educate yourself around what is happening in city council and in the mayor's office and in city hall right now. I mean, there are millions of dollars at stake, in defunding the police. There are millions of dollars at stake missing in budgets for the free library and for arts and culture, for programming and development. And, there are bills on the line about emergency housing that if not enacted could really seriously cause, ripple effects in eviction and homelessness, later this summer and throughout the year. So I think I also sort of, as an advocacy sort of wonk myself, I think what Darla said is really critical, and that at the local level even, you have so much power to tweet or to use social media, to email, to call, to organize young people who may be part of your organizations to have those conversations with elected officials and stakeholders. Because there's really, just in the next 2 weeks, so much on the line.
Wow, that was really rich. I am overwhelmed. I think just with the amount of information. Want to thank our panel. You three were absolutely perfect for this conversation, and I appreciate your wealth of knowledge and your willingness to share it. So just in summary, one, want to thank Stoneleigh for hosting this conversation. Want to thank the participants for staying with us. But I also want to encourage people, we are at a moment. Vote, 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 vote. You've got to get out and understand the things that are on the line. I think Cameron pointed out so eloquently, we've got to make sure we understand the local context. We also have to make sure we're keeping young people at the center and seeking out these new opportunities that are emerging to support them. And one of the participants asked that we put together a list of all these organizations and or ways that we can support. And so I'll work with Stoneleigh to figure out how we can do that and then share it with participants. at a later date. But until then, thank you very much. Remember to stay positive, stay hopeful, stay safe, and peace and blessings to all of you and your families. Thank you.
Thank you.